All right, so today is Friday, March 21st, 2025, and that means it's Human Rights Day in South Africa. And we're diving deep into that today. You've sent over a lot of really interesting material for us to go through today, and we're going to try to really pull out some of the core elements for the listener.
Yeah, we've got material from the Parliament of South Africa itself. We've got some historical context from Wikipedia, some really interesting perspectives from Brand South Africa and the South African Human Rights Commission, some really lively and insightful discussion from the People's Assembly debates, some more academic viewpoints from the University of Zululand, and even some teaching materials.
So we're really trying to give the listener an understanding of where Human Rights Day in South Africa came from, why it's important, and why it's still relevant today. This is your shortcut to being well informed about this very important day. So, just to put things into a bit of a global context for the listener, the concept of human rights is not unique to South Africa. Back in 1948, the UN, the United Nations, adopted something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which had 30 articles. And these articles basically established the rights and fundamental freedoms of every single person on the planet just by virtue of being human.
That's right. And it was based on the principles of humanity, freedom, justice, and peace. And South Africa's really kind of taken that to heart and built it into their legal system. So Chapter 2 of their constitution is called the Bill of Rights. And that lays out all of these different indivisible human rights. And what's really interesting about that is they require a two-thirds majority vote in Parliament to amend any of those rights. So it shows how seriously they take the protection of their citizens' basic human rights.
So let's unpack why March 21st is so significant in South Africa. And to do that, we really need to kind of go back to the apartheid era. So when the National Party came into power in 1948, that marked the formal implementation of segregation, and that segregation was put into effect through tons of discriminatory legislation.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how they designed these laws to really control the daily lives of Black South Africans. So one example of that is the Native Laws Amendment Act of 1952. And basically what this did is it restricted the movement of Black people into urban areas. So under this law, no Black person could leave a rural area to go seek work in a city without authorization. And even if they were given permission, they were typically given only 72 hours to find a job and get another permit.
And then, of course, central to this system of control was the reference book, often just called the pass.
Right.
And this was more than just an ID. This had the person's photograph, it had their origin, it had their employment record, their tax payments, encounters with the police. It was really a tool of control.
And if you look at the sort of broader strategy here, these pass laws were really key to enforcing racial segregation and controlling the Black labor force. And that kind of leads us up to the tragic events of March 21, 1960 in Sharpeville.
The Sharpeville Massacre, a peaceful protest against pass laws that turned violent when apartheid police opened fire on these unarmed protesters, killing 69 people and wounding 180 others. There's a really incredible quote from a book called My Life Struggle by Petrus Tom, who was an eyewitness to the Sharpeville Massacre. And he describes the initial disbelief and then the horrifying realization of what was happening. He said, at first we thought it was firecrackers going off, but as soon as the cloud of smoke cleared, we saw people dropping to the ground like flies. It was just it was a massacre.
And this event really exposed the actions of the apartheid government to the world. So you have these vivid images and these firsthand accounts, and that really kind of galvanized these global anti-apartheid movements and led to stronger condemnation of the South African government and even sanctions against the regime. And it really changed it from being viewed as an internal political issue to a critical global human rights issue.
And then fast forward to the transition to a democratic South Africa. This was a huge, turning point in the country's history. Following the first multiracial democratic elections in 1994 with Nelson Mandela as the president, March 21st was officially declared Human Rights Day and a public holiday.
Right, and what was really kind of key here is the purpose of the day. So Human Rights Day is meant to be a time for South Africans to pause and reflect on the basic rights that they have. It's a call to actively protect those rights and also to protect the rights of all people living in South Africa. And that's regardless of race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, or nationality. So really this focus on the universality and equality of those rights.
And I also noticed in the material that there's a pretty big emphasis on being vigilant and reporting abuse and cruelty.
Oh, absolutely.
So things like human trafficking, child labor, forced labor, and violence against vulnerable groups such as women, children, and the elderly.
Yeah, so it's really making it clear that the responsibility for protecting human rights doesn't just rest with the government. It's a responsibility that each individual shares.
And then how about the role of Parliament in all of this?
Well, Parliament's role is absolutely key. They operate under the Constitution and under its values and principles.
What are some of Parliament's key functions?
Some of the key functions are to represent and empower the people. They also want to make sure that civil society organizations can have a voice in the process, and then they pass laws and they oversee the actions of the executive branch of the government. So making sure that all those democratic processes reach all citizens and that everybody's civil liberties are protected.
So the Parliament of South Africa itself says that it welcomes visitors to the receptacle and guardian of the legacy of human rights in South Africa.
Yeah.
And it's worth mentioning again just how progressive South Africa's constitution is, particularly the Bill of Rights.
Oh, yeah. It's widely regarded as one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And it really shows the country's commitment to these principles of human rights.
And I noticed that this commitment has really come through in the various parliamentary debates that we looked at. So in 1996, Nelson Mandela gave an address on Human Rights Day, and he talked about the importance of the day as a time to remember the sacrifices that were made in the struggle for freedom, but also to really look at how far the country had come in enshrining human rights and values. And he talked about the Freedom Charter as a historical roadmap for human rights culture. But some of these debates also sort of bring to light some concerns and challenges that are still present in South Africa. So there's this question of whether the government is truly upholding human rights and delivering on the dreams of all South Africans. For example, Kliptown is the very place where the Freedom Charter was adopted.
Right.
And in these debates, some people were pointing to the living conditions in Kliptown today as not really being in line with the ideals of the Freedom Charter.
And I think that really kind of highlights this tension that sometimes exists between those ideals and the reality of daily life for a lot of South Africans. There's also the example of the Marikana massacre.
Oh, yeah.
That was brought up in some of these debates. And it really highlights the ongoing challenges in upholding those basic human rights, particularly the right to life and access to justice. And a lot of people were saying, look, these institutions that are meant to support democracy, they really need to operate freely and independently and without undue influence from the government.
Right. There's also a lot of talk about the importance of tolerance and celebrating the diversity of South African society.
Absolutely.
And the issue of domestic violence also came up a lot, and the need to, really make a concerted effort to combat it.
Yeah, and connecting that back to some of those more socioeconomic rights, that struggle for access to adequate housing is so important because it's viewed as being linked to that struggle for freedom and human dignity. And then the fact that sometimes they underspend on really basic public services like clean water and sanitation, a lot of people view that as really impacting people's dignity.
Yeah, and it also became clear in these debates that even though you have these constitutional guarantees in place, the actual enjoyment of these rights isn't always equal for everybody. So, some people brought up students facing financial constraints in accessing education and people not having access to things like clean water or adequate health care.
Right. And then there's also the persistent and really deep-rooted issue of racism.
Yeah.
That's a huge topic of ongoing discussion and concern. And there's this constant debate in Parliament about the need to really acknowledge and address the legacy of the past, and even going so far as to really try to understand the nuance between white racism versus black racism and how those are portrayed in the media. And people were bringing up cases like the Maloto case and the Van der Merwe case to kind of illustrate how there are these different reactions and interpretations depending on who's involved.
It was also really interesting to see how people were talking about the liberation struggle itself as a humanist endeavor.
Yeah.
Really rooted in this concept of human dignity. And then they talk about the violence that happened during the transition to democracy and the negotiations around the interim constitution in 1993, and how that was a really stark reminder of just how much opposition there was to these changes.
Right. And when you compare that to now, in the past, they had this system where they would classify people by race at the Home Affairs Office. And a child's whole life could be determined by a racial label that they were given, sometimes just assigned in a tea room.
Wow.
But now you have this constitutional guarantee of citizenship at birth for all children born in South Africa. So, big changes. But there are still some really huge challenges, particularly inequality.
Right.
That persists. South Africa has a very high Gini coefficient, and that measures income inequality. So there's still a long way to go in terms of closing that gap between the wealthy and the poor.
Freedom of religion and belief also came up in a lot of the debates, and while that's constitutionally protected in South Africa, there were people voicing concerns about increasing global restrictions on religious freedom, and then also about xenophobia in South Africa and how that sometimes encroaches on those freedoms.
Right. And if you look at things from a specifically women's rights perspective, there's just this long history of oppression.
Yeah,
And, some people were bringing up the example of Sarah Bartman
yeah,
and the things that she was subjected to.
right.
The parliamentary debates also talk a lot about the challenges that women in rural areas still face. But they also do acknowledge the legislative progress that's been made, like the creation of the Ministry for Women, Children, and People with Disabilities.
Yeah.
So that was a positive step. And then there was this real emphasis on recognizing that some cultural practices like ukhuthwala, which is a form of forced marriage and female genital mutilation, they're human rights violations, and they can't be justified or excused as cultural traditions.
Right. The Freedom Charter and the Constitution really strongly emphasize that South Africa belongs to everyone who lives there,
Right.
regardless of race. And some people were bringing up the issue of traditional leaders in the Western Cape as sort of a test case for how this principle can be applied.
Yeah. And there was this sense in these debates that it's really important to try to catch problems early on before they escalate,
Right.
preventative measures, but also the fact that sometimes you hear this argument that prisoners are better fed than some citizens. And that really just speaks to the disparities in wealth and resources.
Yeah, and I also noticed a lot of discussion about the impact of corruption
Oh, yeah?
and how that really hinders the realization of human rights, because corruption prevents the government from actually providing services and upholding the rights of all citizens.
Yeah, it really undermines everything. And I think ultimately the foundational principles that we find in the Constitution, dignity and equality, they're meant to be more than just ideals. The challenge is to make those ideals a reality for everyone in South Africa.
And the ANC, the African National Congress, has had a really long history in developing policies around human rights.
Oh, yeah, going back to the 1923 Bill of Rights for Africans, the 1943 African Claims, the Women's Charter in 1956, and, of course, the Freedom Charter in 1955.
Really showing a commitment to those ideas.
Yeah, and I think it also shows the link between economic emancipation and political freedom.
But, of course, there were also some criticisms of the ANC raised in the debates.
Oh, yeah.
Some people were talking about poor service delivery and blaming things like cadre deployment for that.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were some arguments about denial of historical context, people arguing about when exactly South Africa's problems began.
Right.
It's really complex.
Yeah. And then if we look at the global context a bit, the Vienna Declaration emphasizes the universality of human rights
Okay.
and the role of national human rights institutions like the SAHRC.
The South African Human Rights Commission.
Right. And the Vienna Declaration also calls for national action plans to promote and protect human rights. So it's not just about words, it's about actually taking concrete steps.
So education is key. And independent human rights institutions.
Yeah, those are crucial.
I also saw that Africa Human Rights Day is another opportunity to think about the rule of law and respect for human rights across the continent.
Absolutely. And there were some concerns about, are leaders really upholding these principles?
Right.
Because in some cases they're not. And there's this whole idea of what makes a failed state. And that's when a state basically loses control of its territory, it loses authority, can't provide services, and it can't really interact on the international stage.
Yeah.
And there's this Mo Ibrahim Foundation Index, which connects good governance and sustainable development. So it looks at things like security, corruption, and human rights. And it really shows how all of these things are interconnected.
Right. And then this idea that South Africa, often called the cradle of humanity, has a special responsibility
Yeah.
to really make sure that human rights flourish there. So Human Rights Day isn't just about remembering Sharpeville. It's about creating a better future for all South Africans.
Exactly. And in recent years, they've really focused on the theme of consolidating and sustaining human rights culture into the future.
Okay.
So really looking ahead.
Yeah. And even tourism is being seen through this lens now, this human rights lens.
Yeah. So the idea is to showcase South Africa's history and culture, but in a way that respects human rights and doesn't discriminate.
Makes sense.
And then the SAHRC, the South African Human Rights Commission, they commemorate International Human Rights Day every year on December 10th. And that really highlights the legacy of Nelson Mandela and promotes the importance of human dignity. And then there's this global context, too. The Vienna Declaration and Program of Action and the Paris Principles are really important documents that outline international standards for human rights. And even though there's been progress, there are still huge challenges in the 21st century, like poverty, environmental degradation, and human trafficking.
So the work's not done.
Yeah, the work's never done. And we need to keep recommitting to the ideals that people like Nelson Mandela fought for.
So Human Rights Day in South Africa, it's more than just a public holiday.
Absolutely. It's a reminder of a painful past, but it's also a celebration of the progress that's been made. And it's a call to action, to keep working towards a future where everyone's rights are respected and protected.
So just to bring it all home for the listener, Human Rights Day, which falls on March 21st every year, is a commemoration of the Sharpeville Massacre. It marks South Africa's commitment to human rights as enshrined in its constitution. And the day serves as a call to reflect on the past, to protect those rights, and to make sure that everybody in South Africa can enjoy those rights equally.
Right. And we've talked about the progress that's been made, but there's still a lot of work to do to address those historical injustices and the ongoing challenges. And I think a big question for everyone listening is, what's the single most important thing that could be done to really create a strong human rights culture in South Africa for everyone? It's a tough question, but it's one worth thinking about.
Yeah, and to help you think about that, we really encourage you to go back to those resources that we mentioned, especially the South African Constitution and those People's Assembly debates. Really dive in and make your own informed opinion.
I think the big takeaway here is that the pursuit of human dignity and equality, it's not a destination, it's a journey. And it's a journey that requires all of us to be active participants. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening.